Welcome, everybody, to Freelance Writing Direct. I'm your host, Estelle Erasmus, the author of Writing That Gets Noticed, Find Your Voice, Become a Better Storyteller, Get Published, which was named by Poets and Writers a best book for writers. Every week, I speak with novelists, with authors, with writers of every niche to talk about their tips, their tricks, their strategies, and how the sauce is made, including creative advice. I'll talk about essays and articles and share my own experience from 3 decades of publishing. So join me every week and grow your business and build your craft with Freelance Writing Direct. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. And follow along on Substack, where I share special clips for subscribers only at estelleserasmus.substack.com. Welcome, everybody, to this episode of Freelance Writing Direct. I'm your host, Estelle Erasmus, and I'm so happy to have Athena Dixon with us today on the program. And let me tell you a little bit about her. She is the author of essay collections, The Incredible Shrinking Woman and The Loneliness File. And her work appears in publications such as Harper's Bazaar, Shenandoah, Grub Street, Narratively, and Lit Hub, among others. She is a consulting editor for Fourth Genre and the Nonfiction hybrid editor for Split Lip Press. Welcome, Athena.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
So great to see you again. So let's start with talking about the loneliness files. And this is really interesting because you cover loneliness in all its many permutations. Examples of people in the news who died alone, to popular shows and how they portrayed it, to people that, like, there were mysteries of how they even died, and you connected everything to your own feelings of, at the time, isolation, suicidal ideation, things like that. And so, and I know that this is around the time of the pandemic as well,
Yes.
that inspired it, which seems a very fitting time because there's the loneliness and isolation of being behind your mask. There's
Yes.
loneliness and isolation of, as you say in the book, dealing with grief, because grief
Yes.
is an isolating emotion. And the loneliness and isolation of being single, being in an apartment, and really having your world start revolving around just your immediate, what your access is and whatever that
Yes.
web access is. So can you talk about how this idea came about? Because it's a memoir and essays. So you
Yes.
pulled different essays together. There's some you wrote new and some you pulled together and different pieces. And how did
Yes.
that all kind of come about?
So the genesis of the book was that I started writing the first essay in March of 2020. I went from working 5 days a week in an office for my day job to working at home exclusively. Within like a couple of hours, we went to the office and they said, okay, get your laptop and go home. And we didn't come back into the office for like 2 years. So I went from having people around me every day and having connections and going out and hanging out and having fun because I lived like 8 hours from my family. So once that was kind of taken away from me, I got the first couple of weeks, I was like, okay, this is cool. I can work from home. I don't have to deal with people. And then as it got into the months, I was like, oh, this is really scary because this is the first time that I've really been by myself in this way. And so one of the things that I did was I started to play video game walkthroughs on YouTube in the background of my day because there was a human voice that would stop and start and it made like noise, like kind of being in an office. And the one that I gravitated towards was a horror video game. And so the algorithm of YouTube started showing me these videos about people who had died. And I latched on to Joyce Carol Vincent, who is the woman that I talk about in the opening essay of the book. And we're both Generation X. And her story scared me because there were so many similarities. Like she has multiple siblings. She was working in a corporate job at some point. She was very connected to the world and she died and they didn't find her body for 3 years. And
Mm.
so I started to really think, how did I get to this point that during a global pandemic, I'm by myself? I'm 8 hours from my family. I don't have a significant other. I don't have kids. I don't have a pet. It's just me in an apartment. And so I started really writing about the fear of being alone. And that first essay was originally titled Cats May Eat My Body. It eventually changed, but I started writing about that. And then once that essay was done, I started thinking, well, this is not the only way that loneliness shows up in my life. And so during COVID, I had a lot of death in my family and friend circle, and I only got to go to one of those funerals out of the 9 that happened. And so I started thinking about, okay, loneliness shows up in grief. It shows up in being a certain age without a significant other or children. And so I just started writing all these essays. And once I got maybe like 50% of the essays done, I said, okay, this might be like a real project. And so I started actively working toward putting the rest of the essays together and writing the book.
Wow. And so how did you decide one of that you even use like somebody else's journal entry, right?
Oh, that's actually my journal. It's my journal, but the inscription at the top of that essay is from my grandmother's journal. My
Oh,
grandmother passed, my last living grandparent passed in April of 2022. And when she passed, I went home to help my mother plan her funeral. And part of that planning was my mother gave me my grandmother's journal. And I was terrified to read it for many, many months. And that was the opening page of her journal. The first thing you saw when you opened it was that inscription.
okay. Yeah. It says to those concerned, this book is just a few recorded events or happenings in my lifetime. The journal of Willie Mae Horn passed to her daughter, Sharon Dixon, upon Mrs. Horn's passing
Mhm.
in April 2022. And
Yes.
so that, okay, so yeah, so that really supports all the things that you're talking about in loneliness and
Mhm.
even generational loneliness.
Yeah.
There was so many interesting ways that you address things. Like one of them is you talk about the split in yourself, like, and you referenced a photo from childhood where you're smiling, and then the other one is like you have a different expression.
Yeah.
And you're saying that, there was like a split, and that's part of the loneliness too, because how you present yourself to the
Mhm.
outside world. If there's a dichotomy between how you're presenting and how you're feeling, and
Mhm.
so that the loneliness is in the gap there, as
Right.
you say in the book. And what's so interesting is you also work for a place called Split Lip Press, which is,
Yes.
I thought the split theme was interesting.
It was the universe coming back. But it's very interesting because especially as a child, like I think that there's this expectation. I grew up an only child for like 12 years, and my sister is 12 years younger than me. There's just the two of us. But I grew up in a very, very big family. My mom has 9 siblings. My father has 4 siblings. I have lots of cousins and friends. And I grew up in a very small town. So kind of everybody knew everybody. So it's very difficult to explain that from a child up until now, I've always felt a little bit disconnected because you're always surrounded by people. And so that was one of the things that I tried to explore. Like, how do you still feel disconnected when you have the world around you? Like, even if I'm alone right now, I have so many notifications on my phone. I talk to my family every day almost, like, but there's still a disconnection. So I really kind of wanted to explore that split. Like, there's Athena in the world and there's kind of Athena behind the scenes. And sometimes there's overlap and a lot of times there's not. There's really like a separate existence when I'm by myself.
And bringing up your dad, you mentioned a
Mhm.
part in the book where he recognized that you were starting to be distant, you were starting to drift,
Mhm.
you weren't fully there. And he went, and that's, to me, this is the most loving thing a parent can do. He collected you. He
Yes.
started taking you back for until you're ready, and
Mhm.
you needed that at that
Yeah.
time.
I think he recognized. I just kept telling him that I was tired, and he was like, "That's not the normal tired. Like, there's something deeper than that, and if you're not gonna be able to express that to me, I need to physically have you in my space so I can kind of watch you." And my mom did something very similar. I'm not a person who necessarily keeps my nails done and things like that, but when I was kind of in that really heavy season of disconnection, my mother and I had a standing nail appointment. Like, we would go get our nails done. We had a standing appointment. We would go play bingo randomly together because she just wanted to make sure that she was touching me in some way to make sure that I was like tethered to the world.
That's lovely. And they have something called the epidemic of loneliness, which is a
Hmm.
real, true, scientifically proven situation. So you really tied into what's going on in the zeitgeist and equated it to so many situations. You even shared, in terms of format, you shared a braided essay that I thought was really interesting called You Have the Right to Remain Silent. Can you talk a
Hmm.
little bit about that one? I think it's so
Hmm.
cleverly done and makes such an important point.
So that essay is about a police interaction that I had with my best friend when we were about 18 years old on my way to get my driver's license. And in graduate school, my research, I have an MFA in poetry, and my research in grad school was phonetic intensives as building blocks of poetry, like the way that you set your mouth and your tongue and your teeth and your throat, and how those positions help dictate how the sounds come out of your body. And the way that the sounds come out of your body can have different meanings. So, like I say, look versus stare versus glare. They're all the same action, but just the way that they're formed in the body and the connotations that they have can change the meaning of something. And so that essay really was me kind of experimenting with the idea of losing my language in the moment and not remembering how to really speak because I was so afraid about what was going on with the guns and the being surrounded by the police that I was like, okay, what's a vessel for this story? And for me, the vessel became, how do I get my language back? How do I, in real time, learn how to speak again? And so I used the knowledge that I had about phonetic intensives and how linguistics work to kind of heighten the emotion of not being able to have a voice in that particular situation. And also kind of leaving it at the end of that essay with it not being resolved. Like I didn't tell my parents about that incident until I was like in my 30s. It was happening when I was like 18. And so I wanted to use the vessel of the body to kind of play with the fear of the heart in a way.
Yeah, and you begin and end with the breath. You're losing the breath, and at the end,
Mm,
the right to remain silent, the right to breathe again when the vibrations and the breath return is your last sentence. But it's just very gripping because the police officer is exerting control, and then you're saying control linguistically, what that means.
mhm.
And it's just a real fascinating essay to read. I really enjoyed reading that. You talk about relationships as well, the different ways you can be lonely. So if you're like kind of a fan of somebody or just,
Yeah,
and it's not an equal thing, that's a way of being lonely.
it
Can you talk
is.
a little bit more about that and how you talk about the dating apps and all that?
I think my loneliness in that aspect are twofold. I've been divorced for a decade plus at this up level, and I have not really had an established relationship since the divorce. And so there's a loneliness there of being of a certain age. I'm in my 40s, that there's this expectation that I should be attached to somebody. And the essays that I write about dating kind of lean into the idea that it's very difficult. There are many factors that go into being lonely, especially when it comes to dating apps. Like it's scientifically proven that Black women and Asian men have the least success on dating apps. You're the least responded to, you get the least interaction. And so putting yourself in a dating pool that's already a little bit difficult and being the least desired, quote unquote, makes it even lonelier because you're the people that you're getting to choose from don't exist as much on those apps. And so there's a loneliness there. There's also a loneliness that I write about in the book about just missing the mundane intimacies of having a partner in the house, of just always being alone, not having someone to cook dinner with, not having somebody to consider when you come home, that there's a loneliness in that and kind of the disconnection. Like you don't want the grand gestures of a relationship. You want just these small moments that it has of having a partner. And then in terms of loneliness when it comes to like I call it like a digital loneliness. So one of the ways that I talk about loneliness in the book is like having this hyperfixation with writing fan fiction. And part of that is because I consider fan fiction almost like digital romance novels in a way. That romance novels are very popular for a reason. There's something that people need and they're aching for, that they are desiring or yearning for, that exists there in fan fiction. For a long time, that was it for me. That like if I couldn't have this in the real world, how can I take my feelings and my emotions and the things that I want and put them into a creative vessel? And so fan fiction became, knowing realistically you're never going to meet these people, most of them are fictional, but how can I find an outlet for those feelings, and how can I find a way to deal with them, but also connecting with other people who have those same kind of emotions. That's kind of been the beauty of the book over the last year or so, is being able to find people who have very similar feelings and connect with them in that way. And fan fiction really did that for me.
That's so interesting. So the loneliness, did the fan fiction abate the loneliness in some ways?
I think that it did, because it was a way for me to kind of like not only puzzle through creatively how to engage with an audience. I always credit fan fiction with keeping me writing, because there were a few years I wasn't writing at all. And the only stuff that I was writing was fan fiction. I think at my last count, I wrote like a 500,000 words of fan fiction in like a couple year span. But it was the only thing that I was writing. So creatively, it stopped me from being lonely, because there was a world of people writing the kind of similar stuff and engaging with me. And then personally, it allowed me to kind of daydream in a different way. Like daydreams in your head and daydreams on the paper are two different things for me. And so being able to write fan fiction allowed me to say, these are the things that I desire. And until I have a human vessel to put them in, I can set them on this page and I can go back and read them as I need to.
That's so nice. It makes it like a talisman for you and something very tangible. It's
Mhm.
not just the ruminations in your mind.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think too, part of it is that oftentimes, especially I'm divorced, and so I've had a lot of time to kind of figure out what I want and what I don't want, and being able to write it into like action helps me determine like, okay, if this person presents himself to me in real life, I'm not going to have like this idealized love, but I know kind of the things that I want to kind of look for, the markers that are important to me. So important to me that I'm spending my free time writing about them. So it's just like a little bit of a roadmap for myself, if and when that romance comes to fruition.
I love that. You can manifest it into being from,
Exactly.
I completely believe that.
Yeah.
And you also talk about, I love rituals that are positive and upbeat. And you
Mhm.
used one for, I think, the new year, do you want to talk a little bit about that? I love that.
Yes, so I used to have what I call the good things jar. So over the course of a year, I have a jar that I keep in my office, and I just put little talismans over the course of the year. So a ticket stub or a cork from a bottle of champagne, or just random things that connect me to good memories that happened during the year. So I can go through at the end of the year and look at those things and remember that some things were really, really bad, but there was a lot of good, enough to fill up this jar. And so on New Year's Eve, before I go out to whatever plans I have, I look at everything in that jar, and I bag them and I keep them for the years. And now I have a new tradition that I am doing, my intentions jar. And so I have a jar in my office now, and I put little things that remind me of something that I want for the coming year. So the current year has like a few little pieces of Chanel ribbon for luxury. It has a little bit of money. It has a seed for some to grow creative ideas. And so I fill this jar with intentions for the coming year. And then when New Year's Day comes, I'll look at those intentions and set my goals for the year. So I have the beginning and the ending of the year with these jars.
I think it's very powerful. I do something I talk about in my book as a birthday ritual. I light up a candle and visualize the things that I want and the protection
Mhm.
I want for the coming year. And I feel
Yes.
it's a very, I do that for each member of my family.
Uh-huh. Yeah, like it's just a nice little thing to have a physical reminder of like grounding yourself into what you want and what you should be grateful for the past year. Because I know it's very easy as the year comes to an end. Like my book ends on New Year's Eve and opens on New Year's Eve, but it's very easy at the end of the year to think that you didn't accomplish a lot of stuff, and you find the goals that were still on your list from the beginning of the year. Like, but shifting that lens and just looking at the good stuff that actually happened. I even keep like a digital version on my phone. It's called my writing wins folder. So every time something writing happens, I screenshot it and I keep it in a folder. So when I feel like the rejection is really heavy this day, or I spend months without a publication, I just scroll through to say, oh no, you've done a lot of stuff. It's just not in this moment, you're not getting anything, but it exists, right? So I try to keep little grounding techniques around my life so I can be appreciative of what I have.
That is really wonderful. And I mean, it's so funny because I read the book and I'm like, oh, loneliness. And sometimes I'm a little like with difficult topics. I'm like, And, it made me think back, like when I was single, I would keep the TV on all night, just to have a
Mhm.
voice.
Yeah,
And it wasn't a pandemic.
right.
I've been married almost 20 years, but I remember that. So I thought, oh, okay. But knowing you're such a warm person. I love the pink that you're wearing
Thank
today,
you.
by the way, my favorite. And but the book it had weight to it in terms of depth. And it also involves some interesting research. Like you talked about Ka, the Egyptian, can
Mhm.
you talk about that a little bit and how you came about with the terms that you wanted to research?
I'm a little bit obsessive when I get a topic in my head. I call it the kernel of curiosity. So everything that I write has this kernel at the center of it that I've come across in some way, shape, or form that I've gotten really obsessed with. Right now, I'm really obsessed with Medusa and sirens. But in terms of this book, I was writing and watching and researching so much stuff that I was finding these little things that I was hyper fixated on. And so the idea of Ka actually ties to the book that I'm currently writing, which has a lot of goddesses and things in it. But that's how I focus. So when I started writing about like the Truman Show and the essay in service of the algorithm, I started with the kernel of the Truman Show, and then I researched everything I could about that. And so I did that because it helps me find new avenues in. So that's how in the Truman Show essay you see, I'm not only talking about that movie, I'm talking about the Twilight Zone. I'm also talking about the racial injustice and unrest in 2020 and tying that to the idea of the world around us not being real or not blinking. So it's just a hyper fixation. I get really, really into a thing and then I find out everything that I can about it. And then I parse out what I want to have be included in the actual work. I'm also a little bit of an overwriter. So in this book, I think we cut out maybe like 4 to 5 thousand words when it went into edits because I had one essay that was like 7 parts that didn't need to be 7 parts, but it was because I was really obsessed with the idea of rituals. So I wrote everything that I could about superstitions and rituals. So that's what it is. It's just like an obsession with an idea and I chase it down until I can't anymore. And then I backtrack and get the most important parts of it.
And so what was your background? How did you come to this writing practice?
I have always been like, my dad likes to tell the story about me knowing how to read really, really, really early and knowing how to write really, really early. But I grew up an only child for like 12 years. And so one of the ways that I kind of dealt with the world because I was really shy and kind of like a loner at an early age was I wrote stories all the time. I just wrote and wrote and wrote. I still have them. They're in a little suitcase in my office. And then that turned to writing poetry, which turned to me doing kind of like school newsletters. And then I got to college and I got heavily involved in the open mic and spoken word scene. And that led me to doing book reviews and movie reviews. And eventually, after I got my MFA, I decided that I was going to write poetry. Like I was going to write poetry books, and I had a chapbook come out in 2018. And when I went through the divorce, I started writing personal essay, and it became a genre that I got really comfortable in. And so I swapped genres. But it's just been a lifetime of me writing and eventually going to workshops and eventually going to college and getting an English degree and an MFA. But all of it is hinged on this like curiosity and this need to write. Like I always tell people, like, if I wasn't actively publishing like individual pieces and books, I would still be writing because it's just the way that I express myself. I can't imagine not writing because it's always been a constant in my life since I was a kid.
That's a wonderful explanation, and it just shares so much. And I find a lot of writers, they started expressing themselves as children, and then maybe something stopped, or life intervened, and then they come
Yeah.
to it. But you seem to have kept that thread all.
Well, I will say that I did not for a very long time. I was always writing, but I didn't necessarily think that I could be a full-time writer. I'm not a full-time writer. I don't necessarily strive to be a full-time writer anymore. But outside of a couple of years out of high school, I didn't really take it as a serious career option. Like I knew that it was something that people told me that I was good at. I was very invested. I was very curious about it. But it was always kind of like, oh, you do this, but you also have a full-time day job. And I've had a full-time day job that's completely detached from writing for like 16 years. And so my writing is now becoming more important well, more important both financially and creatively and life-wise than my day job. But for a long time, I really didn't think that I could step away from a traditional career path in order to have writing be the thing that sustained me. And thankfully, I'm getting to the point now where I can see that as a possibility.
Is it a very separate career, separate
Yeah.
industry?
No,
Okay.
yeah, completely separate. It has nothing to do with writing. And that's not even in academia. It's like a completely like I joke with the IT people at my job. We're talking about, I have a picture of my book cover in my cubicle. That's like the only thing that I have related to my outside life. And he comes to me one day. He's like, I Googled you. And I'm like, why did you do that? And he's like, you're kind of famous. Why are you here? I'm like, I'm not famous. And also I like having health insurance and other things that come along with a full-time day job. So yeah. But hopefully one day I'll flop the two lives, but it's completely detached. But I will say that it's been very helpful. I like to be very honest when I talk about writing and money. It's been helpful to have because it allows me to travel and do AWP every year. It allows me to go to writing workshops and things of that nature. So it's very useful to have. It's just completely not writing related.
It gives you options. What did you come away with from doing this book? And was there something you learned in it that you're like, I'll either take this to the next book or I'm gonna not do this with the next book?
Yeah. I think the biggest thing that I came away with after kind of writing the book and sitting with it for the last year or so and doing the book tour and talking to people about the book was that I think I went into the book thinking that I would have not necessarily a solution for feeling lonely, but I thought that I would have a better handle on maybe why I felt this way about kind of being disconnected and isolated and needing that space. But I think what I came away with was the idea that I don't necessarily want my loneliness to go away. I think that it's useful for me in some ways. My job is just to figure out when I'm digging too deeply into it. I've gotten to learn myself a lot better. So I know that I have a finite amount of energy when it comes to social interactions and that I need the isolation to build myself back up. Like I went out last night to a happy hour, had a great time. I probably will not do anything again until like Monday because I just need my space to recharge. And so I kind of flipped my idea of loneliness being kind of a bad thing into another skill set that I have, that isolation helps me write. I can't write in a public place. I can't write with other people around. So I know for my creative life, I need isolation, but for my personal life, I know I need to be very aware if I'm not talking to my friends and my family for more than a couple days at a time, because that means I might be a little bit too deep into it. So it really was me getting an understanding of how loneliness and isolation is a tool for me versus like a hindrance.
That's so interesting. Yeah, I love that using it as a tool in your tool belt, that you can just pull out when you need. So let's do a segue and talk a little bit about your consulting editor for Fourth Genre and you're the nonfiction hybrid editor for Split Lip Press. So let's
Mhm.
talk first about Fourth Genre.
Yes. So I am one of a group of consulting editors who are kind of like tiebreakers. So if something goes through the reading team and there's like kind of a split between yeses and nos, or just like a question about whether or not it should kind of be accepted, they assign them to us and then we kind of go in and we give comments and we kind of break ties. And I've been doing that for maybe like we're coming up on 4 years now for fourth genre. So it's really interesting to see because I don't have to read a lot of pieces, but it's interesting to see on the back end what pieces are really, really close to consideration. I think sometimes people on the other side are like, oh, it's just a no. Like sometimes it really is a group of people having a real debate and comments about whether it's going to be a yes or a no. So it's really cool to kind of be able to advocate for pieces that you really like, but also kind of give constructive criticism about pieces that may need a little bit more work before they come in.
Cool. And what about Split Lip?
So for Split Lip, I am the nonfiction hybrid editor. This is my first full year doing that. And I head up a team of 8 readers who, during our open reading period every year for nonfiction, which is October 1st to December 1st, we just determine out of all the submissions that we get, what book will come to publication in the following cycle year. So right now, we just closed for submissions on this past Sunday. And so we're going to go over, I think we had like 125 submissions of full-length books. So now we're going to go through and determine which one of those 125 books is going to be the next nonfiction book for the press. And so I am charged with kind of keeping the submissions assigned to the readers, coming up with the top 5 list, and then heading into the meeting with the director and the assistant director to make the final decision.
And is that through Submittable?
Yes.
Yeah.
SplitLip has 2-month reading periods for a variety of different genres. So we have short story, flash fiction, we have hybrid nonfiction, we have full-length novel, and they each have like a 2-month open period during the course of the year.
Yeah, I know the part that burns with Janine Olette.
Yes.
That you published that, and she was a guest on the program also.
Yes. I love her, and I love that book. Our books came out in the same year from SplitLip, and I love her book.
Your book came out when?
The SplitLip book came out in 2020, and then my Tin House book came out in 2023.
And now Tin House is no more as a publisher? Is that what happened?
The magazine is no, but the books division is still yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, and they also still do educational things too.
Yes,
right?
the workshops and the craft intensives and things.
Okay, great. And so is there any advice, like for anybody who wants to do a memoir and essays themselves, that you can give to either parse out like what essays or how to structure it, or even why somebody should choose a memoir and essays instead of just writing a straight memoir?
I think the biggest thing when you're considering memoir and essay is to be very honest with yourself about your creative skill set. I know that it is very unlikely that I'm going to write a traditional narrative for a memoir, because the way that scenes formulate in my head, the way that dialogue works in my head, the way that I tell a story is not cohesive, and it's not going to fit like a traditional narrative arc. I'm not going to hit the beats that I need to hit. So for me, it makes sense for me to write it in fragmented pieces. It makes sense for me to write standalone pieces. They may have some loose links to each other. So having that kind of conversation with yourself, like, what are my strengths? What are the things that I struggle with? Because you don't want to go into writing like a traditional memoir and you know that you're going to write a 400-page book with no dialogue. It's probably not going to work too well. So like, if you're really not good at the dialogue, you might want to think about, am I better at scene setting? And maybe the scene setting works in an individual piece versus like a larger chapter. And so thinking about that first. And then once you have this idea that you want to write the memoir and essay, you have to really look at how closely you want those essays to be linked. Do you want to have those essays so closely linked that you can't read an individual piece? And then you have to consider on the back end, does that mean that your book can't be excerpted? Does it mean that you have to give a lot of explanation when you do readings because you have to build up the background? So how closely do you want those essays to be linked? And can they stand alone in any kind of way? And then I think the most important thing is when you're writing a memoir and essay is to find all the pathways into that particular topic. I look at my books kind of like an arrow. So I have like the main quiver. So it's like the main through line. So for the loneliness files, I knew that book was going to be about loneliness and isolation. And then everything that shot off from that was a different way that manifested in my life. And so I didn't necessarily need the book to be this rumination on a specific type of loneliness. I just needed you to have the breadcrumb in each essay that there was a different version of it. So determining what that main through line is, and then figuring out all the different vessels that you can put those stories in. And then that gives you your answer about how closely they're going to be linked. It's going to give you answers about whether or not the story should be more cohesive and more of a narrative arc. So you can kind of work backwards to those questions, but those are the 3 main ones. Like, I had to have a very kind of like honest conversation with myself about what I'm good at and what I'm not good at. And I know that I'm good at structuring a sentence. I know that I'm very, very good at line rhythm. And I know that I can't sustain that kind of skill set over a larger book. So I write to my strengths and then I backfill the stuff that I'm not as strong with.
That's brilliant. And so what if the word through line, a lot of people are confused with that. So when you're saying through line, if somebody's writing a memoir and essays, they have to have like a strong repetitive theme that goes throughout the through line. So let's say
Yeah.
with motherhood and maybe
Hmm.
it's abandonment, so
Right.
each essay would tie in with the sense of abandonment and hit it maybe from all angles, like you hit loneliness from all angles.
Right. Because you kind of don't want to like have, you can have a lot of individual essays that are really, really well written. But if you're reading and your readers are getting to the end of essay number one, and then essay number two starts in a completely different like field, like there's a disconnect. Like one of the things that you have to be really careful with memoirs and essays is you have to still set up some kind of flow, whether that be through the ordering of the individual pieces or having that through line where they know, okay, this essay is about my specific mother and the issues that me may have, and the next essay might be about a toy that existed in my sister's life, but there's a connection to motherhood because my father's mother gave it to her. So even though the subject matter in each essay might be different, there still has to be some kind of like small breadcrumb, some kind of thread. So we know that we're still in the same universe. Like we don't have to be in the same neighborhood, but we need to be in the same universe at least so that we're not just being catapulted all over the place.
And so how did you figure out your flow? Like what made you think, I know you started with New Year's and ended with
Mhm.
New Year's, but
Yeah.
did you want to do it based on time? Because it wasn't specific to time.
Right. There was a lot of trial and error. I will say that the book was in multiple formats before I got to the final one. So originally I thought, okay, I'm going to tell the story in chronological order. But then I was like, well, if I tell it in chronological order, that's a lot of time span. And I'm not going to write a long book. And I don't want to cram a lot of decades into like 175 pages. So chronological didn't work because it just didn't make sense to try to cram all that story into that number of pages. So then I segmented it by subject matter. So I thought, okay, it makes sense. So that's how the book ended up in the three parts. So the first section of the book is about things that happen out into the world. So it's a larger scope. And then the second section is where I currently exist and how I got to be where I currently exist. And so that the scope kind of shrunk a little bit. And then the last section is the micro view. So it's me in very specific situations of grief where I'm really by myself. So I was like, I can't tell it in a time order. So I'm going to tell it almost like in concentric circles. So I'm getting you to an isolated place by the end of the book. And then I also segmented my book with a playlist. Originally, the book had individual songs for every essay. And through the editorial process, we discovered that that was breaking up the flow, that you would be in this kind of groove of reading an essay. And then all of a sudden I said, stop, listen to a song. And so it broke up the flow of people being able to immerse into what I was writing. And so we decided there would just be like a playlist for each section. So 3 songs per section. And the reason why that was there was because there's an essay in the book called Deprivation, which is about me floating in a float tank in the dark and with no sound and everything. And I didn't want people to go into that kind of essay very kind of amped up. So I put songs that were very kind of lulling, and I wanted them to get into kind of like an emotional and physical space to read what came after those 3 songs. And so I'm not telling the people that they have to read it, but it's also an interactive thing. So I was just really thinking about how do I best make emotional movement? And then how do I best make body movement in the piece? And then in terms of ending and starting on New Year's, that was just a very conscious decision with for readers who may need actual physical time, that the opening of the book starts with me being very fearful about being alone on New Year's, and the last essay ends kind of with like a little bit of hope that we know that there's been this death in that essay, my aunt who passed away, but I'm also like, but now the new year is starting over and I've survived this year by myself. So there's some kind of emotional movement. There's not a resolution, but I'm better than I was when I started the book.
The feeling of closure in a way,
Yeah.
there's
Hmm.
still more forward momentum. And that's where you
Yes.
talk about your ritual also and
Yes.
intentions, which is a nice place for it. I love that you have the playlist throughout
Mhm.
because that, again, it grounds it in a sense of time and place with,
Mhm.
it gives that additional layer, I think, to each
Yeah.
essay. This was a wonderful conversation. Is there anything I didn't ask you that you want to share about the process of writing?
I think the biggest thing is the same thing that I say all the time. Is just like be very, I'm gonna say confident, but be very secure in your voice being important. That even though we are writing about the same topics and same subject matter, like there's nobody who can tell that story in the way that you tell it. For a long time, I found myself kind of trying to mimic what I thought memoir and essay should be versus just writing it in my voice. And it wasn't until I decided I was just going to write it the way that I needed to write it that I realized that there was an audience for it. So write your voice. Like it's important. Like people can tell when you're writing for performance, and it can tell when you're writing from passion. And your passion can always be crafted and molded and refined. But performance is never going to have like that same passion in it. So write the passion and then you refine it on the back end, because your voice is the most important tool that you have when you're writing.
Definitely. And voice is, I think, what carries people through to the
Mhm.
rest, to want to read the rest of the story. Thank you so much. It's been
Thank
such a
you.
pleasure, and I can't wait to see what you do next and have you back on the program.
Thank you so much.